3 hours later, Penelope was still in the drawing room, still sitting on the sofa, still staring into space, still trying to figure out how she was going to solve her problems. Correction. Problem, singular. She had only one problem, but for the size of it, she might as well have had 1,000. She wasn't an aggressive person, and she couldn't remember the last time she had a violent thought. But at that moment she could have gladly wrung Cressida Toomley's neck. She watched the door with a Morse sense of fatalism, waiting for her husband to come home, knowing that each ticking second brought her closer to her moment of truth, when she would have to confess everything to him. He wouldn't say, "I told you so." He would never say such a thing, but he would be thinking it. It never occurred to her, not even for a minute, that she might keep this from him. Cressida's threats weren't the sort of thing one hid from one's husband, and besides, she was going to need his help. She wasn't certain what she needed to do, but whatever it was, she didn't know how to do it alone. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She didn't want to pay Cressida. There was no way Cressida would be satisfied with £10,000, not when she thought she could get more. If Penelope capitulated now, she'd be handing money over to Cressida for the rest of her life, which meant that in 1 week's time, Cressida Toomley would tell all the world that Penelope Featherington Bridgerton was the infamous Lady Whistledown. Penelope reckoned she had two choices. She could lie and call Cressida a fool and hope that everyone believed her, or she could try to find some way to twist Cressida's revelation to her advantage. But for the life of her, she didn't know how. Penelope? Colin's voice. She wanted to fling herself into his arms, and at the same time she could barely bring herself to turn around. Penelope? He sounded concerned now, his footsteps increasing in speed as he crossed the room. Dunwoodie said that Cressida was here. He sat next to her and touched her cheek. She turned and saw his face. The corners of his eyes crinkled with worry, his lips slightly parted as they murmured her name. And that was when she finally allowed herself to cry. Funny how she could hold herself together, keep it all inside until she saw him. But now that he was there, all she could do was bury her face in the warmth of his chest, snuggle closer as his arms wrapped around her, as if somehow he could make all her problems go away by his presence alone. Penelope? He asked, his voice soft and worried. What happened? What's wrong? Penelope just shook her head, the motion having to suffice until she could think of the words, summon the courage, stop the tears. What did she do to you? Oh, Colin, she said, somehow summoning the energy to pull herself far enough back so that she could see his face. She knows. His skin went white. How? Penelope sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. It's my fault, she whispered. He handed her a handkerchief without ever taking his eyes off of her face. It's not your fault, he said sharply. Her lips slid into a sad smile. She knew that his harsh tone was meant for Cressida, but she deserved it as well. No, she said, her voice laced with resignation. It is. It happened exactly as you said it would. I wasn't paying attention to what I wrote. I slipped up. What did you do? he asked. She told him everything, starting with Cressida's entrance and ending with her demands for money. She confessed that her poor choice of words was going to be her ruin, but it wasn't. But wasn't it ironic? Because it really did feel like her heart was breaking. But the whole time she spoke, she felt him slipping away. He was listening to her, but he wasn't there with her. His eyes took on a strange, faraway look, and yet they were narrowed, intense. He was plotting something, she was sure of it. It terrified her and thrilled her. Whatever he was planning, whatever he was thinking, it was all for her. She hated that it had been her stupidity that forced him into this dilemma, but she couldn't stem the tingle of excitement that swept across her skin as she watched him. Colin? She asked hesitantly. She'd been done speaking for a full minute, and still he hadn't said anything. I'll take care of everything, he said. I don't want you to worry about a thing. I assure you that is impossible, she said with a shaking voice. I take my wedding vows quite seriously, he replied, his tone almost frighteningly even. I believe I promised to honor and keep you. Let me help you, she said impulsively. Together we can solve this. One corner of his mouth lifted into a hint of a smile. Have you a solution? She shook her head. No, I've been thinking all day, and I don't know. Although what? He asked, his brows rising. Her lips parted, then pursed, then parted again as she said, what if I enlisted the aid of Lady Danbury? You're planning to ask her to pay off Cressida? No, she said, even though the tone of his voice told her that his had not been a serious question. I am going to ask her to be me. I beg your pardon? Everyone thinks she's Lady Whistledown anyway, Penelope explained. At least, quite a lot of people do. If she were to make an announcement, Cressida would refute it instantly, Colin interrupted. Who would believe Cressida over Lady Danbury? Penelope turned to him with wide, earnest eyes. I wouldn't I wouldn't dare cross Lady Danbury in any matter. If she were to say she was Lady Whistledown, I'd probably believe her myself. What makes you think you can convince Lady Danbury to lie for you? Well, Penelope replied, chewing on her lower lip, she likes me. She likes you? Colin echoed. She does, rather. I think she might like to help me, especially since she detests Cressida almost as much as I do. You think her fondness for you will lead her to lie to the entire ton? He asked doubtfully. She sagged in her seat. It's worth asking. He stood, his movement abrupt, and walked to the window. Promise me you won't go to her. But promise me. I promise, she said. But no buts, he said. If we need to, we'll contact Lady Danbury, but not until I have a chance to think of something else. He raked his hand through his hair. There must be something else. We have a week, she said softly, but she didn't find her words reassuring, and it was difficult to imagine that Colin did either. He turned around, his about face so precise he might have been in the military. I'll be back, he said, heading for the door. But where are you going? Penelope cried out, jumping to her feet. I have to think, he said, pausing with his hand on the doorknob. You can't think here with me? She whispered. His face softened, and he crossed back to her side. He murmured her name, tenderly taking her face in his hand. I love you, he said, his voice low and fervent. I love you with everything I am, everything I have been, and everything I hope to be. Colin, I love you with my pasts, and I love you for my future. He bent forward and kissed her once, softly on the lips. I love you for the children we'll have and for the years we'll have together. I love you for every one of my smiles, and even more for every one of your smiles. Penelope sagged against the back of a nearby chair. I love you, he repeated. You know that, do you? She nodded, closing her eyes as her cheeks rubbed against his hands. I have things to do, he said, and I won't be able to concentrate if I'm thinking about you, worrying if you're crying, wondering if you're hurt. I'm fine, she whispered. I am fine now that I've told you. I will make this right, he vowed. I just need you to trust me. She opened her eyes. With my life. He smiled, and suddenly she knew that his words were true. Everything would be all right. Maybe not today, and maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Tragedy couldn't coexist in a world with one of Colin's smiles. I don't think it will come to that, he said fondly, giving her cheek one affectionate stroke before returning his arms to his sides. He walked back to the door, turning the moment his hand touched the knob. Don't forget about my sister's party tonight. Penelope let out a short groan. Do we have to? The last thing I want to do is go out in public. We have to, Colin said. Daphne doesn't host balls very often, and she'd be crushed if we did not attend. I know, Penelope said with a sigh. I know. I knew it even as I complained. I'm sorry. He smiled wryly. It's all right. You're entitled to a bit of a bad mood today. Yes, she said, trying to return the smile. I am, aren't I? I'll be back later, he promised. Where are you? She started to ask, then caught herself. He obviously didn't want questions just then, even from her. But to her surprise, he answered, to see my brother. Anthony? Yes. She nodded encouragingly, murmuring, Go. I will be fine. The Bridgertons had always found strength in other Bridgertons. If Colin felt he needed his brother's counsel, then he should go without delay. Don't forget to prepare for Daphne's ball, he reminded her. She gave him a half-hearted salute and watched as he left the room. Then she moved to the window to watch him walk by, but he never appeared. He must have headed straight out the back to the mews. She sighed, allowing her bottom to rest against the windowsill for support. She hadn't realized just how much she'd wanted to catch one last glimpse of him. She wished she knew what he was planning. She wished she could be sure he even had a plan. But at the same time, she felt oddly at ease. Colin would make this right. He'd said he would, and he never lied. She knew that her idea to enlist the aid of Lady Danbury wasn't a perfect solution, but unless Colin came up with a better idea, what else could they do? For now, she would try to push it all from her mind. She was so weary and so very tired, and right now what she needed was to close her eyes and think of nothing but the green of her husband's eyes, the shining light of his smile. Tomorrow, tomorrow she would help Colin solve their problems. Today she would rest. She would take a nap and pray for sleep and try to figure out how she would face all of society this evening, knowing that Cressida would be there, watching and waiting for her to make a false move. One would think that nearly a dozen years of pretending she was nothing more than the wallflowerish Penelope Featherington She'd be used to playing roles and hiding her true self, but that was when her secret had been safe. Everything was different now. Penelope curled up on the sofa and closed her eyes. Everything was different now. But that didn't mean that it had to be worse, did it? Everything would be fine. It would. It had to, didn't it? Hmm. Colin was starting to regret his decision to take a carriage over to his brother's house. He'd wanted to talk. The vigorous use of his legs and feet and muscles seemed the only sociable, acceptable outlet for his fury. But he'd recognized that time was of the essence, and even with traffic, a carriage could convey him to Mayfair faster than could his own feet. But now the walls seemed too close and the air too thick, and goddammit, was that an overturned milk wagon blocking the street? Colin poked his head out the door, hanging out of the carriage even as they were still rolling to a halt. Goodness, he muttered, taking in the scene. Broken glass littered the street. Milk was flowing everywhere, and he couldn't tell who was screeching louder, the horses, which were still tangled in the reins, or the ladies on the pavement, whose dresses had been completely spattered with milk. Colin jumped down from his carriage, intending to help clear the scene, but it quickly became apparent that Oxford Street would be a snarl for at least an hour, with or without his help. He checked to make sure that the milk wagon horses were being properly cared for, informed his driver that he would be continuing on foot, and took off walking. He started. He stared defiantly in the faces of each person he passed, perversely enjoying the way they averted their eyes when faced with his obvious hostility. He almost wished one of them would make a comment, just so he could have someone to lash out at. It didn't matter that the only person he really wanted to throttle was Cressida Toomley. By this point, anyone would have been a fine target. His anger was making him unbalanced, unreasonable, unlike himself. He still wasn't certain what had happened to him when Penelope had told him of Cressida's threats. This was more than anger, greater than fury. This was physical. It coursed through his veins, pulsed beneath his skin. He wanted to hit someone. He wanted to kick things, put his fist through a wall. He'd been furious when Penelope had published her last column. In fact, he'd thought he couldn't possibly experience a greater anger. He was wrong. Or perhaps it was just that this was a different sort of anger. Someone was trying to hurt the one person he loved above all others. How could he tolerate that? How could he allow it to happen? The answer was simple. He couldn't. He had to stop this. He had to do something. After so many years of ambling through life, laughing at the antics of others, it was time to take action himself. He looked up, somewhat surprised that he was already at Bridgerton House. Funny how it no longer seemed like home. He'd grown up there, but now it was so obviously his brother's house. Home was in Bloomsbury. Home was with Penelope. Home was anywhere with Penelope. Colin? He turned around. Anthony was on the pavement, obviously returning from an errand or appointment. Anthony nodded toward the door. Were you planning to knock? Colin looked blankly at his brother, just then realizing that he'd been standing perfectly still on the steps for good knows how long. Colin? Anthony asked again, his brow furrowing with concern. I need your help, Colin said. It was all he needed to say. Penelope was already dressed for the ball when her maid brought in a note from Colin. Dunwoody got it from the messenger, the maid explained, before bobbing a quick curtsy and leaving Penelope to read the note in privacy. Penelope slid her gloved finger under the envelope flap and nudged it open, pulling out the single sheet of paper on which she saw the fine, neat handwriting that had become so familiar to her since she'd started editing Colin's journal. I will make my way over to the ball this evening. Please proceed to number 5. Mother Eloise and Hyacinth are waiting to accompany you to Hastings House. All my love, Colin. For someone who wrote so well in his journals, he wasn't much of a correspondent, Penelope thought with a wry smile. She stood, smoothing out the fine silk of her skirts. She'd chosen a dress of her favorite color, sage green, in hopes that it might lend her courage. Her mother had always said that when a woman looked good, she felt good, and she rather thought her mother was right. Heaven knows, she'd spent a good 8 years of her life feeling rather bad in the dresses her mother had insisted looked good. Her hair had been dressed in a loosely upswept fashion that flattered her face, and her maid had even combed something through the strands. Penelope was afraid to ask. That seemed to bring out the red highlights. Red hair wasn't very fashionable, of course, but Colin had once said he liked the way the candlelight made her hair more colorful, so Penelope had decided that this was one case upon which she and fashion would have to disagree. By the time she made her way downstairs, her carriage was waiting for her, and the driver had already been instructed to take her to number 5. Colin had clearly taken care of everything. Penelope wasn't sure why this surprised her. He wasn't the sort of man who forgot details, but he was preoccupied today. It seemed odd that he would have taken the time to send instructions to the staff about her delivery to his mother's house, when she could have conveyed the order just as well herself. He had to be planning something, but what? Was he going to intercept Cressida Toomley and have her shipped off to a penal colony? No, too melodramatic. Maybe he'd found a secret about her and was planning to cross-blackmail her. Silence for silence. Penelope nodded approvingly as her carriage rolled along Oxford Street. That had to be the answer. It was just like Colin to come up with something so diabolically fitting and clever. But what could he possibly have unearthed about Cressida in so short a time? In all her years as Lady Whistledown, she'd never even heard a whisper of anything truly scandalous attached to Cressida's name. Cressida was mean, and Cressida was petty, but she'd never stepped outside the rules of society. The only true daring thing she'd ever done was claim to be Lady Whistledown. The carriage turned south into Mayfair, and a few minutes later they came to a stop in front of number 5. Eloise must have been watching at the window, because she virtually flew down the steps and would have crashed into the carriage had the driver not stepped down at that precise moment and blocked her path. Eloise jumped from foot to foot as she waited for the driver to open the carriage door. In fact, she looked so impatient that Penelope was surprised she didn't brush past him and wrench the door open herself. Finally, ignoring the driver's offer of help, She climbed into the carriage, nearly tripping on her skirts and tumbling to the floor in the process. As soon as she'd righted herself, she looked both ways, her face pursed into an extremely furtive expression, and yanked the door shut, nearly taking off the driver's nose in the process. "What," Eloise demanded, "is going on?" Penelope just stared at her. "I could ask the same of you." "You could? Why?" "Because you nearly knocked over the carriage in your haste to climb inside." "Oh." Eloise sniffed dismissively. "You have only yourself to blame for that." "Me?" "Yes, you. I want to know what's going on, and I need to know tonight." Penelope was quite certain that Colin would not have told his sister about Cressida's blackmail demands, not unless his plan was to have Eloise harangue Cressida to death. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "You have to know what I mean," Eloise insisted, glancing back up toward the house. The front door was opening. "Oh, brother." "Mother and Hyacinth are coming already." "Tell me." "Tell you what?" "Why Colin sent us that abominably cryptic note instructing us to stick to you like glue all evening." "He did?" "Yes. And may I point out that he underlined the word glue?" "And here I thought that the emphasis was yours," Penelope said dryly. Eloise scowled. "Penelope, this is not the time to poke fun at me." "When is the time?" "Penelope!" "Sorry, I couldn't resist. Do you know what the note was about?" Penelope shook her head, which wasn't a complete lie, she told herself. She really didn't know what Colin had planned for the evening. Just then the door opened and Hyacinth bounded in. "Penelope," she said with great enthusiasm, "what is going on?" "She doesn't know," Eloise said. Hyacinth shot her sister an annoyed look. "It figures you'd sneak out here early." Violet poked her head in. "Are they quarreling?" she asked Penelope. "Just a little," Penelope replied. Violet sat next to Hyacinth across from Penelope and Eloise. "Very well. It's not as if I could stop them anyway. But do tell, what did Colin mean when he instructed us to stick to you like glue?" "I'm sure I don't know." Violet's eyes narrowed, as if assessing Penelope's honesty. "He was quite emphatic. He underlined the word glue, you know." "I know," Penelope replied, just as Eloise said. "I told her." "He underlined it twice," Hyacinth added. "If his ink had been any darker, I'm sure I would have had to go out and slaughter a horse myself." "Hyacinth!" Violet exclaimed. Hyacinth just shrugged. "It's all very intriguing." "Actually," Penelope said, eager to change the subject, or at least to twist it slightly, "what I'm wondering is, what will Colin wear?" That got everyone's attention. "He left home in his afternoon clothes," Penelope explained, "and didn't come back. I can't imagine your sister would accept anything less than full evening kit for her ball." "He'll have borrowed something from Anthony," Eloise said dismissively. "They're precisely the same size, same as Gregory, actually. Only Benedict is different." "2 inches taller," Hyacinth said. Penelope nodded, feigning interest as she glanced out the window. They had just slowed down, the driver presumably trying to navigate through the crush of carriages that were choking Grosvenor Square. "How many people are expected tonight?" Penelope asked. "I believe 500 were invited." Violet replied. Daphne doesn't host parties very often, but what she lacks in frequency she makes up for in size. I'll say, Hyacinth muttered. I hate crowds. I'm not going to be able to get a decent breath tonight. I'm lucky you were my last, Violet told her with weary affection. I'd not have had the energy for any more after you, I'm sure. Pity I wasn't first then, Hyacinth said with a cheeky smile. Think of all the attention I could have had, not to mention the fortune. You're already quite the heiress, as it is, Violet said. And you always manage to find your way to the center of attention, Eloise teased. Hyacinth just grinned. Did you know, Violet said, turning to Penelope, that all of my children are going to be in attendance tonight? I can't remember the last time we were all together. What about your birthday party? Eloise asked. Violet shook her head. Gregory wasn't able to get away from university. We're not expected to line up according to height and sing a festive tune, are we? Hyacinth asked. Only half joking. I can see us now, the singing Bridgertons. We'd make a fortune on stage. You're in a punchy mood tonight, Penelope said to her. Hyacinth shrugged. Just getting myself ready for my upcoming transformation into glue. It seems to require a certain mental preparedness. A gluey frame of mind? Penelope inquired mildly. Precisely. We must get her married off soon, Eloise said to her mother. You first, Hyacinth shot back. I'm working on it, Eloise said cryptically. What? The word's volume was rather amplified by the fact that it exploded from three mouths at once. That's all I'm going to say, Eloise said, and in such a tone of voice that they all knew she meant it. I will get to the bottom of this, Hyacinth assured her mother and Penelope. I'm sure you will, Violet replied. Penelope turned to Eloise and said, You don't stand a chance. Eloise just lifted her chin in the air and looked out of the window. We're here, she announced. The four ladies waited until the driver had opened the door, and then one by one they alighted. My goodness, Violet said approvingly. Daphne has truly outdone herself. It was difficult not to stop and look. All of Hastings House was ablaze with light. Every window had been adorned with candles, and outdoor sources held torches, and outdoor scones held torches, as did a fleet of footmen who were greeting the carriages. It's too bad Lady Whistledown isn't here, Hyacinth said, her voice for once losing its cheeky edge. She would have loved this. Maybe she is here, Eloise said. In fact, she probably is. Did Daphne invite Cressida Toomley? Violet asked. I'm sure she did, Eloise said. Not that I think she's Lady Whistledown. I don't think anyone thinks that any longer, Violet replied, as she lifted her foot onto the first step. Come along, girls. Our night awaits. Hyacinth stepped forward to accompany her mother, while Eloise fell into line beside Penelope. There's magic in the air, Eloise said, looking around as if she'd never seen a London ball before. Do you feel it? Penelope just looked at her, afraid that if she opened her mouth, she'd blurt out all of her secrets. Eloise was right. There was something strange and electric about the night, a crackling sort of energy, the kind one just felt before a thunderstorm. It almost feels like a turning point, Eloise mused, as if one's life could change completely all in one night. What are you saying, Eloise? Penelope asked, alarmed by the look in her friend's eyes. Nothing, Eloise said with a shrug, but a mysterious smile remained upon her lips as she hooked her arm through Penelope's and murmured, "Let's be off. The night awaits." Penelope had been to Hastings House a number of times, both for formal parties and more casual visits, but never had she seen the stately old building look more lively and lovely or more magical than it did that evening. She and the Bridgerton ladies were among the first to arrive. Lady Bridgerton had always said that it was rude for family members even to consider fashionably late entrances. It was nice to be so early, though. Penelope was actually able to see the decorations without having to push through crushing crowds. Daphne had decided not to use a theme for her ball, unlike the Egyptian ball last week and the Grecian one the week before. Rather, she had decorated the house with the same simple elegance with which she lived her everyday life. Hundreds of candles adorned the walls and tables, flickering in the night, reflecting off the enormous chandeliers that hung from the ceilings. The windows were swathed in a shimmery, silvery fabric, the sort of thing one might imagine a fairy to wear. Even the servants had changed their livery. Penelope knew that the Hastings servants usually wore blue and gold, but tonight their blue was adorned with silver. It could almost make a woman feel like a princess in a fairy tale. "I wonder how much this cost," Hyacinth said, eyes wide. "Hyacinth," Violet scolded, patting her daughter on the arm. "You know that it's impolite to ask about such things." "I didn't ask," Hyacinth pointed out. "I wondered. And beside, it's only Daphne." "Your sister is the Duchess of Hastings," Violet said, "and as such she has a certain responsibility to her station. You would do well to remember that fact." "But wouldn't you agree," Hyacinth said, linking her arm around her mother's and giving her hand a little squeeze, "that it's more important simply to remember that she's my sister?" "She has you there," Eloise said with a smile. Violet sighed. "Hyacinth, I declare that you will be the death of me." "No, I won't," Hyacinth replied. "Gregory will." Penelope found herself stifling a laugh. "I don't see Colin here yet," Eloise said, craning her neck. "No?" Penelope scanned the room. "That's surprising. Did he tell you that he would be here before you arrived?" "No," Penelope replied, "but for some reason I rather thought he would." Violet patted her arm. "I'm sure he'll be here soon, Penelope, and then we'll all know what this big secret is that has him insisting we remain by your side. Not," she added hastily, her eyes widening with alarm, "not that we view it as any sort of chore. You know we adore your company." Penelope gave her a reassuring smile. "I know. The feeling is mutual." There were only a few people ahead of them in the receiving line, so it wasn't very long before they were able to greet Daphne and her husband Simon. "What?" Daphne asked without preamble, just as soon as she was sure her other guests were out of earshot, "is going on with Colin?" Since the question appeared to be directed mostly at her, Penelope felt compelled to say, "I don't know." "Did he send you a note as well?" Eloise asked. Daphne nodded. "Yes, we are to keep an eye on her," he said. "It could be worse," Hyacinth said. "We're to stick to her like glue." She leaned forward. He underlined glue. And here I thought I wasn't a chore, Penelope quipped. Oh, you're not, Hyacinth said breezily, but there's something rather enjoyable about the word glue. Slides off the tongue rather pleasingly, don't you think? Glue, glue. Is it me? Eloise asked, or has she gone mad in the head? Hyacinth ignored her with a shrug. Not to mention the drama of it. I feel as if I'm a part of some grand espionage plot. Espionage, Violet groaned. Heaven help us all. Daphne leaned forward with great drama. Well, he told us. It's not a competition, wife, Simon put in. She shot him an annoyed look before turning back to her mother and sisters and saying, he told us to make sure she stays away from Lady Danbury. Lady Danbury! They all exclaimed, except for Penelope, who had a very good idea why Colin might want her to stay away from the elderly countess. He must have come up with something better than her plan to convince Lady Danbury to lie and tell everyone that she was Lady Whistledown. It had to be the double blackmail theory. What else could it be? He must have uncovered some horrible secret about Reseda. Penelope was almost giddy with delight. I thought you were rather good friends with Lady Danbury, Violet said to her. I am, Penelope replied, trying to act perplexed. This is very curious, Hyacinth said, tapping her index finger against her cheek. Very curious indeed. Eloise, Daphne suddenly put in, you're very quiet tonight. Except for when she called me except for when she called me mad, Hyacinth pointed out. Eloise had been staring off into space, or perhaps at something behind Daphne and Simon, and hadn't been paying attention. Oh, well, nothing to say, I suppose. You? Daphne asked doubtfully. Precisely what I was thinking, Hyacinth said. Penelope agreed with Hyacinth, but she decided to keep that to herself. It wasn't like Eloise not to weigh in with an opinion, especially not on a night like this, which was growing more and more shrouded with mystery as each second passed. You all were saying everything so well, Eloise said. What could I possibly add to the conversation? Which struck Penelope as very odd. The sly sarcasm was in character, but Eloise always thought she had something to add to a conversation. Eloise just shrugged. We should be moving along, Violet said. We're beginning to hold up your other guests. I shall see you later, Daphne promised. And oh, everyone leaned in. You will probably want to know, she whispered, that Lady Danbury is not here yet. Simplifies my job, Simon said, looking a bit weary of all the intrigue. Not mine, Hyacinth said. I still have to stick to her. Like glue. They all, including Penelope, finished for her. Well, I do, Hyacinth said. Speaking of glue, Eloise said as they stepped away from Daphne and Simon. Penelope, do you think you can make do with only 2 batches for a bit? I should like to step out for a moment. I will go with you, Hyacinth announced. You can't both go, Violet said. I'm certain Colin didn't want Penelope left with only me. May I go when she's back then? Hyacinth grimaced. It's not something I can avoid. Violet turned to Eloise expectantly. What? Eloise demanded. I was waiting for you to say something. Or say the same thing. I am far too dignified, Eloise sniffed. Oh, please, Hyacinth muttered. Violet groaned. Are you certain you wish us to remain by your side? She asked Penelope. I didn't think I had a choice, Penelope replied, amused by the interchange. Go, Violet said to Eloise. Just hurry back. Eloise gave her mother a nod, and then, much to everyone's surprise, she reached forward and gave Penelope a quick hug. What was that for? Penelope asked, with an affectionate smile. No reason, Eloise replied, her returning grin rather like one of Colin's. I just think this is going to be a special night for you. You do? Penelope asked carefully, unsure of what Eloise might have figured out. Well, it's obvious something is afoot, Eloise said. It's not like Colin to act with such secrecy, and I wanted to offer my support. You'll be back in just a few minutes, Penelope said. Whatever is going to happen, if indeed anything is going to happen, you are not likely to miss it. Eloisa shrugged. It was an impulse born from a dozen years of friendship. Eloise Bridgerton, are you growing sentimental on me? At this late date? Eloisa said with a look of mock outrage. I think not. Eloise, Hyacinth interrupted. Will you leave? I can't wait all night. And with a quick wave, Eloise was off. For the next hour, everyone just milled about, mingling with the other guests and moving, Penelope, Violet, and Hyacinth, as one giant being. 3 heads and 6 legs have we, Penelope remarked, as she walked toward the window, the 2 Bridgerton women bustling right alongside her. I beg your pardon? Violet asked. Did you really want to look out the window? Hyacinth muttered. Or were you just testing us? And where's Eloise? Mostly just testing you, Penelope admitted. And I am sure Eloise was detained by some other guests. You know as well as I that there are many people here from whom it is rather difficult to extract oneself from conversation. Hmm, was Hyacinth's reply. Someone needs to recheck her definition of glue. Hyacinth, Penelope said, if you need to excuse yourself for a few minutes, please do go ahead. I shall be just fine. She turned to Violet. You as well. If you need to leave, I promise I shall remain right here in the corner until you return. Violet looked at her in horror. And break our word to Colin? Did you actually give him your word? Penelope asked. No, but it was implied in his requests, I am sure. Oh, look, she suddenly exclaimed. There he is. Penelope tried to signal discreetly at her husband, but all her attempts at circumspection were drowned out by Hyacinth's vigorous wave and holler of "Colin!" Violet groaned. I know," Hyacinth said, unrepentantly. "I must be more ladylike." "If you know it," Violet said, sounding every inch the mother she was, "then why don't you do it?" "What would be the fun in that?" "Good evening, ladies," Colin said, kissing his mother's hand before smoothly taking his place beside Penelope and sliding his arm around her waist. "Well?" Hyacinth demanded. Colin merely quirked a brow. "Are you going to tell us?" she persisted. "All in good time, dear sister." "You're a wretched, wretched man," Hyacinth grumbled. "I say," Colin murmured, looking about, "what happened to Eloise?" "That's a very good question," Hyacinth muttered. "Just as Penelope said. I'm sure she'll be back soon." He nodded, not looking terribly interested. "Mother," he said, turning toward Violet, "how have you been?" "You've been sending cryptic notes all over town," Violet demanded, "and you want to know how I've been?" He smiled. "Yes." Violet actually started wagging her finger at him, something she'd forbidden her own children from ever doing in public. Oh no, you don't, Colin Bridgerton. You are not going to get out of explaining yourself. I am your mother. Your mother! I am aware of the relation, he murmured. You are not going to waltz in here and distract me with a clever phrase and a beguiling smile. You think my smile is beguiling? Colin! But he acceded. You did make an excellent point. Violet blinked. I did? Yes, about the waltz. He cocked his head slightly to the side. I believe I hear one beginning. I don't hear anything, Hyacinth said. Don't you? Pity. He grabbed Penelope's hand. Come along, wife. I do believe this is our dance. But no one is dancing, Hyacinth ground out. He flashed her he flashed her a satisfied smile. They will be. And then, before anyone had a chance to comment, he'd yanked on Penelope's hand, and they were weaving through the crowds. Didn't you want to waltz? Penelope asked breathlessly, right after they had passed the small orchestra, the members of whom appeared to be taking an extended break. No, just to escape, he explained, slipping through a side door and pulling her along with him. A few moments later they had ascended a narrow staircase and were secreted in some small parlor, their only light the flickering torches that blazed outside the window. Where are we? Penelope asked, looking around. Colin shrugged. I don't know. It seemed as good a place as any. Are you going to tell me what is going on? No. First I'm going to kiss you. And before she had a chance to respond to that, not that she would have protested, his lips found hers in a kiss that was hungry and urgent and tender all in one. Colin, she gasped, in that split second when he took a breath. Not now, he murmured, kissing her again. But this was muffled, lost against his lips. It was the sort of kiss that enveloped her from her head to her toes, from the way his teeth nibbled her lips, to his hands squeezing her bottom and sliding across her back. It was a sort of kiss that could easily have turned her knees to water and led her to swoon on the sofa and allow him to do anything to her. The more wicked the better, even though they were mere yards away from over 500 members of the ton, except Colin, she exclaimed, somehow breaking her mouth free of his. Shush! Colin, you have to stop. He looked like a lost puppy. Must I? Yes, you must. I suppose you're going to say it's because of all the people just next door. No, although that's a very good reason to consider restraint. To consider and then reject, perhaps? He asked hopefully. No, Colin. She pulled herself from his arms and moved several feet away, lest his nearness tempt her into forgetting herself. Colin, you need to tell me what is going on. Well, he said slowly, I was kissing you. That's not what I meant, and you know it. Very well. He walked away, his footsteps echoing loudly in her ears. When he turned back around, his expression had turned deadly serious. I have decided what to do about Cressida. You have? What? Tell me. His face took on a slightly pained expression. Actually, I think it might be best if I didn't tell you until the plan is under way. She stared at him in disbelief. You're not serious. Well? He was looking longingly at the door, clearly hoping for an escape. Tell me, she insisted. Very well. He sighed, then sighed again. Colin, I'm going to make an announcement, he said, as if that would explain and if that as if that would explain everything. At first she said nothing, thinking that maybe it would all become clear if she just waited a moment and thought about it. But that didn't work, and so she asked, her words slow and careful, what sort of announcement? His face turned resolute. I am going to tell the truth, she gasped. About me? He nodded. But you can't. Penelope, I think it's best. Panic began to rise within her, and her lungs fell impossibly tight. No, Colin, you can't. You can't do that. It's not your secret to reveal. Do you want to pay Cressida for the rest of your life? No, of course not, but I can ask a Lady Danbury. You're not going to ask a Lady Danbury to lie on your behalf, he snapped. That's beneath you, and you know it. Penelope gasped at his sharp tone, but deep down she knew he was right. If you were so willing to allow someone else to usurp your identity, he said, then you should have just allowed Cressida to do it. I couldn't, she whispered, not her. Fine, then it's time we both stood up and faced the music. Colin, she whispered, I'll be ruined. He shrugged. We'll move to the country. She shook her head, desperately trying to find the right words. He took her hands in his. Does it really matter so much? He said softly. Penelope, I love you. As long as we're together, we'll be happy. It's not that, she said, trying to tug her hand from his so that she could wipe the tears away from her eyes. But he wouldn't let go. What then? He asked. Colin, you'll be ruined too, she whispered. I don't mind. She stared at him in disbelief. He sounded so so casual about something that would change his entire life, alter it in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Penelope, he said, his voice so reasonable she could barely stand it, it's the only solution. Either we tell the world or Cressida does. We could pay her, she whispered. Is that what you really want to do? He asked. Give her all the money you've worked so hard to earn? You might as well have just to tell her. You might as well have just let her tell the world she was Lady Whistledown. I can't let you do this, she said. I don't think you understand what it means to be outside of society. And you do, he countered. Better than you. Penelope, you're trying to act as if it doesn't matter, but I know you don't feel that way. You were so angry with me when I published that last column, all because you thought I shouldn't have risked the secret getting out. As it turns out, he remarked, I was right. See, she said urgently. Do you see? You're still upset with me over that. Colin let out a long breath. The conversation was not moving in the direction he'd hoped. He certainly hadn't intended for her to throw his earlier insistence that she not tell anyone about her secret life back in his face. If you hadn't published that last column, he said, we wouldn't be in this position. That is true. But the point is now moot, don't you think? Colin, she whispered, if you tell the world I am Lady Whistledown, and they react to the way we think they will, you'll never see your journals published. His heart stood still, because that was when he finally understood her. She had told him before that she loved him, and she had shown her love as well, in all the ways he had taught her. But never before had it been so clear, so frank, so raw. All this time she'd been begging him not to make the announcement. It had all been for him. He swallowed against the lump that was forming in his throat, fought for words, fought even for breath. She reached out and touched his hand, her eyes pleading, her cheeks still wet with tears. I could never forgive myself, she said. I don't want to destroy your dreams. They were never my dreams until I met you, he whispered. You don't want to publish your journals? She asked, blinking in confusion. You were just doing it for me? No, he said, because she deserved nothing less than complete honesty. I do want it. It is my dream. But it's a dream you gave me. That doesn't mean I can take it away. You're not. Yes, I. No, he said forcefully, you're not. And getting my work published, well, it doesn't hold a candle to my real dream, which is spending the rest of my life with you. You'll always have that, she said softly. I know. He smiled, and then it turned rather cocky. So what do we have to lose? Possibly more than we could ever guess. And possibly yes, and possibly less, he reminded her. Don't forget that I am a Bridgerton, and you are now. We wield a bit of power in this town. Her eyes widened. What do you mean? He shrugged modestly. Anthony is prepared to give you his full support. You told Anthony? She gasped. I had to tell Anthony. He's the head of the family, and there are very few people on this earth who would dare to cross him. Oh, Penelope chewed on her lip. Considering all this, and then because she had to know, what did he say? He was surprised. I expected as much, and rather pleased. Her face lit up. Really? And amused. He said he had to admire someone who could keep a secret like that for so many years. He said he couldn't wait to tell Kate. She nodded. I suppose you'll have to make an announcement now the secret is out. Anthony will hold his counsel if I ask him to, Colin said. That has nothing to do with why I want to tell the world the truth. She looked at him expectantly, warily. The truth is, Colin said, tugging on her hand and pulling her close, I am rather proud of you. She felt herself smiling, and it was so strange, because just a few moments earlier she couldn't imagine ever smiling again. He leaned down until his nose touched hers. I want everyone to know how proud I am of you. By the time I am through, there won't be a single person in London who doesn't recognize how clever you are. They may still hate me, she said. They may, he agreed. But that will be their problem, not ours. Oh, Colin, she sighed. I do love you. It's an excellent thing, really. He grinned. I know. No, I really do. I thought I loved you before, and I'm sure I did, but it's nothing like what I feel now. Good, he said, a rather possessive gleam appearing in his eyes. That's the way I like it. Now, come with me. Where? Here, he said, pushing open a door. To Penelope's amazement, she found herself on a small balcony overlooking the entire ballroom. Oh, dear goodness. She gulped, trying to yank him back into the darkened room behind them. No one had seen them yet. They could still make their escape. Tisk tisk, he scolded. Bravery, my sweet. Couldn't you post something in the paper? She whispered urgently. Or just tell someone and allow the rumor to spread? There's nothing like a grand gesture to get the point across. She swallowed convulsively. As gestures went, this was going to be grand. I'm not very good at being the center of attention, she said, trying to remember how to breathe in a normal rhythm. He squeezed her hand. Don't worry, I am. He looked out over the crowd until his eyes found those of their host, his brother-in-law, the Duke of Hastings. At Colin's nod, the Duke began to move toward the orchestra. Simon knows? Penelope gasped. I told him when I arrived. Colin murmured absently. How do you think I knew how to find the room with the balcony? And then the most remarkable thing happened. A veritable fleet of footmen appeared as if from nowhere, and began handing tall flutes of champagne to every guest. Here's ours, Colin said approvingly, picking up two glasses that were waiting in the corner, just as I asked. Penelope took hers silently, still unable to comprehend all that was unfolding around her. It's probably a little flat by now, Colin said, in a conspiratorial sort of whisper that she knew was meant to set her at ease, but it's the best I could do under the circumstances. As Penelope clutched Colin's hand in terror, she watched helplessly as Simon quieted the orchestra and directed a throng of partygoers to turn their attention to his brother and sister on the balcony. His brother and sister, she thought in wonder. The Bridgertons really did inspire a bond. She never thought she'd see the day when a duke referred to her as his sister. Ladies and gentlemen, Colin announced, his strong, confident voice booming throughout the hall, I would like to propose a toast to the most remarkable woman in the world. A low murmur spread across the room, and Penelope stood frozen, watching everyone watching her. I am a newlywed, Colin continued, beguiling the partygoers with his lopsided smile, and therefore you are all required to indulge me in my lovesick ways. Friendly laughter rippled through the crowd. I know that many of you were surprised when I asked Penelope Featherington to be my wife. I was surprised myself. A few unkind titters wafted through the air, but Penelope held herself perfectly still, completely proud. Colin would say the right thing. She knew he would. Colin always said the right thing. I wasn't surprised that I had fallen in love with her, he said pointedly, giving the crowd a look that dared them to comment, but rather that it had taken so long. I have known her for so many years, you see, he continued, his voice softening, and somehow I had never taken the time to look inside, to see the beautiful, brilliant, witty woman she'd become. Penelope could feel the tears trickling down her face, but she couldn't move. She could barely breathe. She had expected him to reveal her secret, and instead he was giving her this incredible gift, the spectacular declaration of love. Therefore, Colin said, with all of you here as my witness, I would like to say, Penelope, he turned to her, taking her free hand in his, and said, I love you, I adore you, I worship the ground you walk upon. He turned back out to the crowd, lifted his glass, and said, To my wife! To your wife, they all boomed, caught up in the magic of the moment. Colin drank, and Penelope drank, even though she couldn't help but wonder when he was going to tell them all the real reason for his announcement. Put down your glass, dear, he murmured, plucking it from her fingers and setting it aside. But you interrupt far too much, he scolded, and then he swept her into a passionate kiss right there on the balcony in front of the entire ton. Colin, she gasped, once he gave her a chance to breathe. He grinned wolfishly as their audience roared its approval. Oh, and one last thing, he called to the crowd. They were now stamping their feet, hanging on his every word. I am leaving the party early, right now, as a matter of fact. He shot a wicked, sideways grin at Penelope. I'm sure you'll understand. The men in the crowd hooted and hollered as Penelope turned beet red. But before I do, I have one last thing to say. One last little thing, in case you still don't believe me when I tell you that my wife is the wittiest, cleverest, most enchanting woman in all of London. No, came a voice from the back, and Penelope knew it was Cressida. But even Cressida was no match for the crowd, none of whom would let her pass, or even listen to her cries of distress. You might say that my wife has two maiden names, he said thoughtfully. Of course you all knew her as Penelope Featherington, as did I. But what you didn't know, and what even I was not clever enough to figure out until she told me herself. He paused, waiting for silence to fall over the room. Is that she is also the brilliant, the witty, the breathtakingly magnificent. Oh, you know all. Oh, you all know who I am talking about, he said, his arms sweeping out toward the crowd. I give you my wife, he said, his love and pride flowing across the room. Lady Whistledown. For a moment there was nothing but silence. It was almost as if no one even dared to breathe. And then it came, clap, 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 slow and methodical, but with such force and determination that everyone had to turn and look to see who had dared to break the shocked silence. It was Lady Danbury. Sweet. She had shoved her cane into someone else's arms and was holding her arms high, clapping loud and proud, beaming with pride and delight. And then someone else began to clap. Penelope jerked her head to see. Who? Anthony Bridgerton. And then Simon Basset, the Duke of Hastings. And then the Bridgerton woman. And then the Featherington woman. And then another and another and more until the entire room was cheering. Penelope couldn't believe it. Tomorrow they might remember to be angry with her, to feel irritated at having been fooled for so many years, but tonight all they could do was admire and cheer. For a woman who had had to carry out all of her accomplishments in secret, it was everything she'd ever dreamed of. Well, almost everything. Everything she'd truly ever dreamed of was standing next to her, his arms around her waist. And when she looked up at him, at his beloved face, he was smiling down at her with such love and pride that her breath caught in her throat. Congratulations, Lady Whistledown, he murmured. I prefer Mrs. Bridgerton, she replied. He grinned. Excellent choice. Can we leave? She whispered. Right now? She nodded. Oh, yes, he said enthusiastically, and no one saw them for several days. Okay, this is the epilogue. Bedford Square, Bloomsbury, London, 1825. Ah, here it is. It's here. Penelope looked up from the paper spread over her desk. Colin was standing in the doorway of her small office, jumping from foot to foot like a schoolboy. Your book! She exclaimed, jumping to her feet as quickly as her rather ungainly body would. Oh, Colin, let me see, I can't wait. He couldn't contain his grin as he handed her his book. Oh, she said reverently, holding the slim, leather-bound volume in her hands. Oh my! She held the book up to her face and inhaled deeply. Don't you just love the smell of new books? Look at this, he said impatiently, pointing to his name on the front cover. Penelope beamed. Look at that, and so elegant too. She ran her finger over the words as she read, An Englishman in Italy by Colin Bridgerton. He looked ready to burst with pride. It looks good, doesn't it? It looks better than good. It looks perfect. When will An Englishman in Cyprus be available? The publisher says every 6 months. They want to release An Englishman in Scotland after that. Oh, Colin, I'm so proud of you. He drew her into his arms, letting his chin rest on top of his head, her head. I couldn't have done this without you. Yes, you could, she replied loyally. Just be quiet and accept the praise. Very well, she said, grinning even though he couldn't see her face. You couldn't. Clearly, you could never have been published without such a talented editor. You won't hear any disagreement from me, he said softly, kissing the top of her head before he let her go. Sit down, he said. You shouldn't be on your feet for too long. I'm fine, she assured him. But she sat down anyway. Colin had been overly protective since the first moment she'd told him she was pregnant. Now that she was only a month from her due date, he was insufferable. What are these papers? He asked, glancing down at her scribblings. This? Oh, it's nothing. She started to gather them into piles. Just a little project I was working on. Really? He sat down across from her. What is it? Well, actually, what is it, Penelope? He asked, looking exceedingly amused by her stammers. I've been at loose ends since I finished editing your journals, she explained, and I found I rather missed writing. He was smiling as he leaned forward. What are you working on? She blushed. She wasn't sure why. A novel. A novel? Why, that's brilliant, Penelope. You think so? Of course I think so. What is it called? Well, I've only written a few dozen pages, she said, and there's much work to be done. But I think if I don't decide to change it over much, that I will call it The Wallflower. His eyes grew warm, almost misty. Really? It's a little bit autobiographical, she admitted. Just a little bit, he returned. Just a little. But but it has a happy ending? Oh, yes, she said fervently. It has to. It has to? She reached her hand across the table and rested it atop his. Happy endings are all I can do, she whispered. I wouldn't know how to write anything else. Hmm. Well, and that everyone is the end of Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. I quite like this one. Did you enjoy it? I did. I really did. Um, Actually, I think what I would have liked at the end, just, some aftermath of, yeah, a little bit of, aftermath story about what happened since the announcement. I think that would have been a nice read for us readers and you listeners. For me, I would have loved to see that. But overall, love the story. I was a huge fan of Penelope all the way through. Big fan of her character. And then all the supporting characters, the Bridgerton family, Eloise. I really like this one. Really like this one. What did you think? I'd like to know what you thought of this too. So do leave a comment. But I'm not sure what the next book will be. But until I read again, peace wherever in the world you are. All right, take care. Bye bye.